Hello, my name is Noel Carroll. I'm a lecturer at NUI Galway in Ireland, and I'm also a researcher with LIRO, the Irish Software Research Centre. So this presentation is going to provide an overview of an IEEE software article that Professor Kieran Conboy and I had published on implementing large-scale agile frameworks, challenges and recommendations. So first of all, just to give you a little background and I suppose a little insight on the motivation for this work. When we talk about large-scale agile development, we know it's increasingly prevalent in contemporary software development organizations. So of course we know that there's many potential benefits around large scale, but large scale transformation are also fraught with many challenges. And through our experience and through a number of literature reviews, we identified a number of issues, for example, around communication issues, lack of flexibility, and also some challenges related to coordination. So as a result, we see and we increasingly see how organizations are beginning to turn more and more towards the use of large-scale agile development frameworks. And in the article we outlined just an example of some of these, such as Scaled Agile Framework or SAFe, Large-Scale Scrum or LESS, Spotify, Nexus, and Scrum at Scale. So these are just some examples that are being increasingly adopted across organizations, and we looked at these in more detail in some of the case studies that we describe in the article. The issue, I guess, with the frameworks is that each of the specific frameworks incorporates predefined workflow patterns and specific routines, and it's often supported by ever-increasing sets of tools. So each tool carries its own type of workflow, its own routine, and specific tools that support or complement that way of working. Yet the use and the effectiveness of these tools and approaches are kind of still in their infancy. And that creates many challenges for us as researchers to understand what works best, but also in terms of trying to convey this to practitioners to understand where certain tools are most effective and indeed are least effective. So when we began to look at the adoption of large-scale agile frameworks, and based on experience over a number of case studies that we outline in the article, we tried to depict this as in terms of the at various stages. So on one hand, we have the expectations of organizations and what they expect from the adoption of these frameworks, and also the time and the time scale of adopting large-scale agile frameworks. So at the very start there, for example, you'll see pre-large-scale agile, where they have little expectations around what type of a framework to adopt. Then they go through like a number of different stages, like the initial large-scale agile thinking and practice. So again, trying to look at the rationale for the adoption of certain frameworks over others. Then it goes through a selection process of a specific large-scale agile framework. And then the whole implementation of the framework. So at this point, there's a greater sense of growing expectation from the use or the value of that framework over a certain time period. So an organization might adopt a particular type of large-scale agile framework. For example, it could be Spotify, and then it goes through a certain time interval before they realize, yeah, this is working for us as an organization. We can now begin to concentrate our efforts on trying to sustain the large-scale agile framework. Or they might decide, well, no, this isn't actually working for us, and it leads to some sort of failure within the organization, but they might adopt a second large-scale agile framework. So they might go for something like SAFe, for example. At that point, the adopted framework might be like a really good fit, for example, if they adopted SAFe, or it could come to a point where they begin to abandon the framework altogether and say that this isn't either the right time or the right approach for us as an organization. We hope that diagram tries to illustrate the key points in terms of the adoption of large-scale frameworks. But we began to look at, I suppose, a 15-year retrospective, and we identify all of these case studies, how organizations are at different points across the agile journey, through, for example, the selection process, the implementation, or even the whole sustainability of a large-scale agile framework. And we looked at how they have adopted a combination of frameworks, or in some cases, they have opted for a custom-built framework. So here's a quick snapshot of the type of organizations, the products or services that they offer, an overview of the year studied, the scale of the organization, the frameworks used, and indeed the team locations. So in the article itself, it gives a little more detail on the case studies and the methodology that we chose. But for the sake of this presentation, I just wanted to give an overview of the types of organizations that we mentioned in the article and that we cover in more detail in that. In the article itself, we describe the actual challenges, and we get into a little more detail and support them with evidence around quotations and so on. But for the purposes of this presentation, I just wanted to give you an overview of the challenges, the 9 challenges that we identified, and the recommendations that we present in the IEEE software article. So, in this summary of the challenges and recommendations, we also are conscious that organisations are considering how they plan for, in the midst of an agile transformation, how they can use our study to identify and preempt challenges that they might have not considered beforehand. So I'll just pick, I suppose, 1 or 2 here, just for the sake of trying to illustrate the points. For the very first challenge, for example, defining the concepts and terms, this was a particular challenge that we saw across a number of organisations, and indeed within organisations. So we know there's a number of different stakeholders obviously involved in the whole selection process of a large-scale agile framework, the whole implementation process, and even sustaining that. But one of the key challenges that we saw at the very outset was trying to understand what exactly is meant by the term agile and the term scale. So the recommendation around this was to spend time reflecting and defining what is meant by agile and scale in your organizational context before actually going about trying to adopt a large-scale agile framework. And this might seem quite simplistic, but when you mix messages in terms of what the preconceived notions of agile and scale is, they really come to create, I suppose, a lot more tension as the organisation begins to scale in terms of the use of an agile framework. So it's quite important to look at trying to establish clear motivations to scale agile development to meet their business needs. And the 2 other recommendations on that is, and I think they're quite important, is to ensure a common vocabulary to capture the vision and value of a large-scale agile transformation. But also this is important to ensure that the common vocabulary is accessible, coherent, and promoted across stakeholders at the early stages of adopting a large-scale agile framework. And in simple terms, this is to ensure that everybody within the organisation or every stakeholder that has an involvement in this process are on the same page and ensure that they have the same understanding of agile and the notion of scaling. I'll just skip on to another point, we'll say number 3. So challenge number 3 was around the readiness and appetite for change. So again, just because organisations are beginning to consider the need to undergo a large-scale transformation, it doesn't necessarily mean that they are actually ready for that, because large-scale transformation is not something that happens over a very short time frame. So you begin to assess, A, is the organisation ready, but B, have they got the appetite to sustain that long journey that's required and involved in the transformation process. So in the recommendations around that, we describe the need to conduct an organisational readiness assessment to examine the potential barriers of adopting specific large-scale agile transformation frameworks. We also suggest that you need to identify the gaps or the issues associated with the steps to resolve issues, for example, the need for increased training, organisational structure change, and new management styles and strategies. Because as we outline in the paper, each large-scale agile framework, it carries its own management approach and kind of management style. So you need to ensure that the selection process of that framework aligns with the organisation and indeed the readiness to adopt that management style as well. So you need to identify the gaps to resolve the issues, but also the third point there is to use an incremental adoption of large-scale agile framework in areas of weaknesses to ensure that smooth transition. And that's important because we've experienced where some organisations might have almost a big bang approach, and this can have a knock-on effect in terms of lack of readiness for the wider organisation to understand and adopt the large-scale agile transformation. Skipping on down towards point number 6 there, the overemphasis on 100% framework adherence over value. So in some cases, organisations would have focused primarily on the need to make sure that they adhere to a specific framework. So they put quite a lot of time and resources into ensuring that they adhere to the practices and processes and so on, almost like a checkbox exercise. But organisations need to decide at what point does it actually make sense or add any value to adhere to these practices, to all of these practices. So they need to determine whether, as a recommendation there on number 6, they need to determine whether the organisational agile transformation prioritises adherence to a specific agile framework or whether the overall success of the method is better for business. So they need to try and differentiate whether adherence or the actual value it drives places more priority for the business. So they also need to identify which transformational factors will influence the adherence over value, such as the standards, the compliance, the speed, the cost, technology, or the customer requirements. And they also need to plan for the optimal degree of transformation of the large-scale framework as per the organizational goals. So as organizations kind of strive for 100% adherence to a specific framework, you may decide as an organization that 80% of adherence to a specific framework is the optimal point for you as an organization, and that it meets your business needs and so on. And just a final point, just to illustrate some of the challenges and the recommendations that's outlined in the article. The misalignment between the customer processes and frameworks. So here, although many organizations have a lot of internal evaluation in terms of, is the framework actually suitable for us as an organization, it's equally important, and sometimes it's overlooked, how the adoption of a certain framework is suitable for your customer needs also. So just as a recommendation, we outline the need to consider involving the customer stakeholders during the selection of a large-scale Agile framework to increase that transparency, cooperation and alignment, and also to examine how the choice of a large-scale Agile framework will provide the organisation with more flexibility to cater for the dynamic needs of the organisation. So it's important to begin to anticipate what might be coming down the line in terms of, is this framework suitable for us in the next 5, 6 or 7 years, for example, which is a challenging task, no doubt. But how robust is this in terms of the future of the organisation and what we have planned strategically as well? So actually going through these challenges and recommendations, we believe it's a useful exercise and can offer some insight in terms of, given that there are many problems associated with the large-scale Agile transformation processes, we envisage that this can be used to use kind of something almost like under the radar in terms of how we can kind of self-assess our ability to successfully transform. And as part of the article, we describe how we'd encourage organizations to take a multi-layered approach across different employees and stakeholder groups, just to get a broader kind of sense of all of these challenges and what they mean from a different stakeholder's perspective. We also outline the need for more comparative views of what success actually looks like and failure looks like in terms of large-scale Agile transformation. And we welcome some additional future research on success and failure of large-scale Agile transformation. So that concludes the short summary of this kind of presentation of our article, but I'd welcome any feedback, your thoughts would be much appreciated. So thank you very much on behalf of myself and Kieran Conboy. Thank you for your time, and we look forward to your feedback.